On a stormy night in 1971, a man in a business suit walked to the back of a passenger jet, strapped $200,000 to his chest, and jumped into a black sky nobody has ever seen him fall out of again. No body, no parachute, no trace. For 53 years, the FBI has called it the only unsolved hijacking in American history. And for 53 years, everyone who has ever tried to solve it has failed. But right now, in a lab that didn't exist when this case went cold, scientists are running a genetic test that older investigators could only have dreamed of. And what they're finding is starting to point somewhere nobody expected. Stay to the end, because the name being whispered right now is not the name you've heard before. To understand why a decades-old necktie is suddenly making headlines again, you have to go back to where this whole story started, on the tarmac of Portland International Airport, on the day before Thanksgiving. He bought his ticket in cash, $20 one way, Portland to Seattle, on a Northwest Orient flight numbered 305. He gave the name Dan Cooper, middle-aged, maybe mid-40s, average height, dark hair combed straight back, wearing sunglasses even indoors. Nobody at the counter thought twice about him. That was the whole point. He looked like exactly the kind of man nobody remembers. He took his seat in the back of the cabin, ordered a drink, lit a cigarette, and waited for the plane to climb. Then he passed a note to the flight attendant walking by. She assumed it was a phone number, the way flight attendants in 1971 often did, and tucked it away without reading it. He leaned over and quietly told her she should probably open it now. She did. The note said he was carrying a bomb, and that he wanted $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes waiting for him when the plane landed. He let her glance inside his briefcase. Wires, cylinders, a battery. Whether it was real or not, it worked. From that point on, everyone on that aircraft did exactly what he asked. The plane circled Seattle for close to 2 hours, while police and airline officials scrambled to gather the ransom. He waited patiently, tipped the crew, and never raised his voice. When the plane finally landed, the exchange happened quietly on the runway. The passengers walked off, unaware of what had actually been happening a few rows behind them. Only the flight crew stayed on board. Then came the part that made this case different from every hijacking before it. He didn't want to land anywhere. He told the pilots to take off again, fly low, under 10,000 feet, slow, with the landing gear down and the flaps partially lowered. And he wanted one very specific thing left unlocked. The rear stairway of the aircraft, the kind that folds down from the tail and can, on that particular model of jet, be lowered mid-flight. That detail told investigators everything about who they were dealing with. This wasn't a man who got lucky. This was a man who had done his homework on this exact airplane. Somewhere over the wooded hills of southwest Washington, in the middle of a freezing rainstorm, the crew felt the plane shift, just slightly, like something heavy had moved toward the tail. A warning light blinked on in the cockpit, indicating the rear stairs had opened. It was a little after 8 in the evening. Outside, at that altitude and that speed, the wind chill would have been brutal enough to take a person's breath away in seconds. And somewhere in that darkness, wearing loafers and a thin suit, with no helmet and no gloves, the man dropped from the stairway and disappeared. When the plane landed in Reno, agents stormed on board expecting to find him still there. He was gone. The stairway hung open to the night. The only things left behind were a handful of cigarette butts, a couple of unused parachutes, and, draped quietly over a seatback, a narrow black clip-on tie. Nobody in that cabin could have guessed that a cheap department store necktie would end up being the single most examined object in the history of American crime investigation. The search that followed was massive. Soldiers combed the forest in long lines. Helicopters swept the treetops. Divers searched the rivers, and they found absolutely nothing. Not a scrap of fabric, not a bone, not a shred of the money. The forest that everyone assumed had swallowed a body simply refused to give anything back. And that silence became the seed of everything that followed. Because if there was no proof he had died, there was no proof he hadn't survived. And once people started believing he might still be out there, the legend took over from the facts. Songs got written about him. A small Washington town started throwing an annual festival in his honor. He became something closer to folk hero than fugitive, a man who had, as the story went, robbed an airline without hurting a soul and beaten the system just by being calm and clever. But investigators weren't interested in folklore. They were interested in serial numbers. Before handing over the ransom, the FBI had quietly photographed every single bill, thousands of 20s, all from the same currency series, all traceable if they ever surfaced. They circulated those numbers to banks nationwide and waited. If Cooper ever spent a single one of those bills, they'd know. Years went by. Nothing. Not one bill turned up in circulation anywhere. No spending spree, no unexplained wealth, no slip-up. That silence cut two ways. Either the money was buried somewhere in that forest along with him, or the man who took it had extraordinary discipline, patient enough to sit on a fortune for years without ever touching it. Then, 9 years later, the case produced its first and only piece of hard physical proof. In February of 1980, an 8-year-old boy on a family camping trip along the Columbia River was digging in the sand to build a fire pit, and his fingers hit something buried a few inches down. It was cash, rotting rubber bands still holding together bundles of $20 bills. His father called it in, and when the FBI ran the numbers, they matched. Nearly $6,000 of the original ransom, sitting in a riverbank miles from where anyone had calculated the drop zone should be. It was proof the case was real, and proof that almost nothing else about it made sense. How had a fraction of the money ended up there while the rest, and the man himself, simply vanished? Geologists studied the sediment layers for years and never agreed on an answer. Every piece of evidence in this case seemed to open 3 new questions instead of closing one. Over the following decades, the FBI investigated more than 1,000 suspects. There was a former paratrooper with a record and a face that matched the sketch. There was a small-time con man whose associates swore he'd bragged about the hijacking. There were multiple deathbed confessions, men who called their children to their bedside in their final days and told them the secret they'd carried their whole lives. Each time, families came forward with old photographs, half-remembered stories, ties they swore looked like the one from the plane. And each time, when agents actually checked the physical evidence against the claim, it fell apart. No fingerprints matched. No confession held up under scrutiny. Memory, it turns out, is a generous thing, especially at the end of a life, when a person wants desperately to believe their story mattered. Through every failed suspect and every dead end, one object sat quietly in an evidence locker, mostly overlooked. That black clip-on tie. For decades, it seemed like the most useless piece of evidence in the file, a cheap, mass-produced accessory that could have belonged to anyone. But forensic science kept advancing, and a tie worn against someone's skin for hours holds onto more than people realize. Sweat, skin cells, microscopic dust from wherever that person spends their days. In recent years, a mixed team of investigators and independent researchers went back to that tie with instruments the original agents in 1971 couldn't have imagined. Under an electron microscope, the fibers revealed tens of thousands of microscopic particles, mostly the ordinary debris of daily life. But scattered through the sample were traces that stood out, fragments of titanium, stainless steel, and other metals rarely encountered outside industrial or aerospace settings. Not proof of who he was, but a strong hint of the kind of world he moved through. In 1971, titanium wasn't something an average office worker brushed up against by accident. It belonged to factories, machine shops, and the aerospace industry that was booming across the Pacific Northwest at the time. That detail reframed the whole profile. This wasn't necessarily a desperate amateur or a battle-hardened paratrooper. It looked more like someone who understood aircraft because he'd spent his working life around them. Someone comfortable discussing altitude and pressurization and the mechanics of a jet's rear stairway because that was simply his world. And now, researchers working independently of the Bureau are attempting the thing that once sounded almost impossible, pulling usable genetic material from that same 50-year-old tie. It's an enormous challenge. Over 5 decades, that fabric passed through dozens of hands, agents, technicians, evidence clerks, anyone who ever opened that folder and lifted it into the light. Any DNA on it now is a tangle of profiles, most of them probably belonging to the people who've handled the case file over the years, not to the hijacker himself. Even so, researchers have managed to isolate a partial genetic profile from areas of the tie most likely to have only been touched by the wearer, the knot. The inner folds close to the collar. It's incomplete. It's degraded by decades of handling and storage. But it's real material, and it's enough to attempt something the case has never had before. A genealogical search. The same method that has cracked other cold cases by comparing crime scene DNA against public ancestry databases, not to find a direct match, but to find relatives, the faint genetic echoes people leave scattered across their extended family trees. That search is still ongoing, and this is the part where honesty matters more than excitement. As of right now, no identity has been confirmed. Nobody has definitively named the man who walked onto that plane in 1971. What genealogical researchers have found is a set of promising leads pointing toward family lines connected to the aerospace manufacturing hubs of the Pacific Northwest, exactly the kind of background the titanium particles already suggested. It's a compelling convergence of two independent types of evidence, pointing in a similar direction. But convergence is not confirmation, and any responsible account of this case has to say that plainly. The FBI closed its active investigation into the case back in 2016, not because they solved it, but because the leads had gone cold enough that continuing to pour resources into it stopped making sense. That official closure didn't stop the independent researchers, the amateur genealogists, and the retired agents who've stayed obsessed with this case for most of their careers. If anything, it motivated them, because a case that officially nobody is working anymore is a case where fresh eyes and new forensic tools can move without institutional pressure to protect old theories. Skeptics inside and outside the investigation are right to push back hard on where this is heading. They point out that titanium particles on a 50-year-old tie could have come from 100 innocent sources, a second-hand purchase, incidental contact, contamination in storage. They point out that a partial, degraded DNA profile pulled from an item handled by dozens of people over 5 decades carries a real margin of error, and that genealogical searches, powerful as they become, have misidentified people before, sometimes with painful consequences for entirely innocent families. Extraordinary claims about a 53-year-old mystery deserve extraordinary evidence, and right now what exists is a strong lead, not a verdict. The researchers pursuing this angle would agree with that caution, even as they argue that no previous suspect in the case's long history has ever had this many independent threads lining up at once. The aerospace-linked metal traces, the genealogical direction, and the profile of a calm, technically knowledgeable man who clearly understood the exact aircraft he chose to hijack. Both the skeptics and the believers are looking at the same fragile pile of evidence and drawing different, reasonable conclusions from it. That tension, more than any single revelation, is exactly where this case stands today. What can be said with confidence is this: the metal particles are real, examined and documented by legitimate forensic researchers. The partial DNA profile is real, and the genealogical technique behind this kind of search has genuinely solved other cold cases in recent years. The investigation into an aerospace-connected suspect is more credible today than any lead in this case has been in a very long time. But it is still an active lead, not a closed file, and anyone telling you this case has been definitively solved is getting ahead of the actual evidence. Maybe that's the most fitting thing about the whole story. For 53 years, the public built this man into a legend, a daredevil criminal mastermind who beat impossible odds and vanished into thin air. And every time the evidence is actually spoken, it's pointed towards something smaller and stranger. An ordinary, unremarkable person who understood one specific machine well enough to exploit it, and who then simply walked back into an ordinary life so completely that the world spent half a century looking straight past him. The tie is still sitting in its evidence bag. The partial genetic profile is still sitting in a database, waiting for the right distant relative to take a DNA test and light up a match nobody's found yet. Somewhere out there, in a family tree that genealogists haven't finished climbing, there may be a living relative whose own DNA could finally turn a compelling theory into a confirmed answer. Until that happens, the case the FBI once called the only unsolved hijacking in American history stays exactly that, unsolved, but for the first time in decades, not silent. So here's what I want to know from you. If it turns out the man behind this legend really was just an ordinary machinist and not the criminal mastermind everyone imagined, does that make the mystery feel smaller to you? Or does it actually make it more unsettling that someone that ordinary could disappear that completely? Let me know what you think down in the comments. And if this case has you hooked, stick around, because the next mystery we're covering has a twist that genuinely surprised me when I first read about it.